Hi everyone. I went to Conowingo Dam yesterday with my local photo club here, and it's actually run by one of my viewers, David Crooks. And Conowingo Dam is known for its bald eagles. Now, it's better to go in the wintertime. I guess there's a lot more of them around, but I went yesterday in the spring, April 3rd or whatever, and there weren't really too many bald eagles. There was just a few flying around, but I did end up getting a few good shots. And what I wanted to share with you was some of the settings that I used, and I'll walk you through exactly, everything I did and give you some alternatives and why you might want to choose different settings than I did. But generally speaking, these settings have worked well for me whenever I do my birds in flight type photography, regardless of what kind of bird it is. And we'll talk about that more, but let's go ahead and get into the camera settings, and then we'll do a little montage of my day there at Conowingo. All right, the first thing you want to do is change your mode dial to shutter priority. As indicated in the bottom left, you can see the letter S, so we are in shutter priority mode. And then change your shutter speed to 1/2000th of a second. That'll be our default setting. And then in the super control panel, you want to change your AF target mode to all points. So if it's on anything else, just rotate the front dial until you get back to all points. And then everything else that you see here in the super control panel, we're going to make changes directly in the camera's menu itself. All right, so let's just dive into the menu and let's go to the first page here, basic settings. And all I do here is I make sure image review and shading compensation is off. On page 2, I use just standard picture profile, keep warm colors off, white balance auto, sRGB. These settings are kind of irrelevant because I'm shooting raw anyway. But those are good settings for JPEG as well. And then for ISO, I like to maximize the ISO to the limits. So we have 102,400 and 200 as the minimum. And the lowest shutter speed, it's kind of irrelevant because we're going to be shooting in shutter priority anyway. But generally you're shooting with a telephoto lens, say 300 millimeters, and you really don't want to have a slower shutter speed than 1/250th of a second. And then I make sure ISO auto is on in all modes. ISO step is irrelevant because we're going to be in auto ISO. I turn the noise filter off. I set this to drive priority and noise reduction off. And then flicker scan, I make sure that's off because we're going to be outdoors anyway without any artificial lighting. And I like to set my EV steps to 1 EV. So when I'm changing my shutter speed in shutter priority, my default setting is 1/2000th of a second, but I can quickly go to 1/1000th of a second by one click of the dial, or I can go to 1/4000th of a second with one click of the dial in the other direction. So I just prefer to work faster by stepping in full stops, but some people like the default setting of 1/3 EV, but I find this works better for me. It's just faster in the field. And then for metering, I'm going to use the standard ESP metering. Some people prefer center weighted, but to me, I find that sometimes the birds are not in the center, right? They're in the corner of the frame, and I don't want the camera to really be way off in metering. It's not going to be, but I just generally use the ESP metering here and let the camera decide. And the rest of these settings are kind of irrelevant. Other than this one, I do have metering during sequential shooting. I make sure this is set to yes, because the bird could be flying from a dark area to a bright area, and you're just doing a burst mode. And you want to make sure that the camera is adjusting the exposure as the lighting changes. On the next page, flash is irrelevant here. Okay, for drive mode, I just use sequential shooting here because this is 20 frames per second, right? It's more than fast enough for me. Some people like to use the SH1, or I'm sorry, the SH2, because you can get up to 50 frames per second with a compatible lens, like my 300 f4 Pro, but I just found I was coming home with thousands of images to call through when I did that, so I just stick to this one, 20 frames per second. And then let's see, sequential shooting settings, flickering is irrelevant, but make sure that's off because we're going to be outdoors. And if that's on, it may slow down the response of your camera. So again, I'm at 20 frames per second. And then when I do Pro Capture, I tend to use the regular Pro Capture, 10 frames and 20 frames per second. But of course you can choose other ones. But just remember, anytime you pick an SH1 version, that it's not going to refocus after the first shot. It's going to lock the focus. In anti-shock settings, I turn off. In silent settings, I like to allow the speaker, so that when I have pressed the shutter button and it locks focus, I get that confirmation beep. Some people like this off, but I just prefer it on. And then the image stabilizer, I leave it on auto, just because I don't know if I'm going to be panning up and down or left and right. So I want to just let the camera decide. You can get better performance if you know you're going to be panning horizontally a lot versus vertically, or vice versa. But for me, I just leave it on auto. All right, image stabilizer, I like to have it set to IS priority, meaning the camera will try to stabilize the camera before it takes the picture, versus frames per second priority. It's going to give the shooting speed priority, meaning it's going to attempt to do the 20 frames per second over trying to stabilize the image first. So for me personally, I like to have this on, but some people prefer frames per second, again, because shooting speed is more of a priority than the image stabilization. And this can make sense a lot of times because we are going to be shooting at very fast shutter speeds, like 1/2000th, 1/4000th, and you know, image stabilization plays a very, very small role at this point. And then I make sure that this is also on the image stabilizer. So when I have pressed the shutter button, the view in the EVF will stabilize so I can better focus or compose, especially things like bird on a stick. Because when you're using telephoto lenses, the image can be very jerky. So this helps a lot with composition. And then I make sure these two items are off here. We're not going to do anything computational. Now in the AF menu, I choose CAF, not CAF tracking or manual focus, nothing else, CAF. And then I turn this off. I make sure the AF by half pressing is turned on, and also I have the AF on in manual mode. Again, not that important, but here, release priority, I do like to make sure that both of these are off. Now when you have this turned off, basically it tells the camera not to take a picture unless it thinks it's locked focus. And, you know, in continuous autofocus, it's going to continually focus the camera on your subject while it's moving, and it will not take a picture unless it thinks it did lock focus when you push the shutter button all the way down. When you have this turned on, the camera will continuously autofocus and try to acquire focus, but it's going to give shooting speed priority over locking focus. And some people prefer this, especially when they lock focus on the first half press. And then, you know, you got plenty of depth of field. There's a lot of different reasons, but they prefer their shooting speed over locking focus. And you can get more keepers this way, technically, I think, when you have this turned on. But I just prefer to have this off so that I know that the camera thought it had focus when it took a picture. And then, of course, subject detect, you want to set the birds. And eye detection frame I like to have turned on so that you get that little box around the bird's eye if it detects it. And AF illuminator off because, again, we're outdoors and the subjects are really far away. Now for AF area pointer, now when you watch the montage after this, I did have on 2 set because I thought I would like that better. But about halfway through, I decided to turn this off because all of the AF points blinking over the subject was a little bit distracting. So I prefer to have just on 1 where I just have the solid white box around the bird. I just found that easier to look at than having all these blinking green lights all over. And you'll see this in the montage. So just be conscious that I was in on 2 at the beginning, and then you'll see me switch to on 1 about halfway through. And then here, CF sensitivity I set to +2 because, you know, I'm going to be basically shooting an open sky, and the birds are going to be coming to, you know, flying towards me and away from me at a pretty high speed. So I want the camera to refocus as quickly as possible as the subject's moving. Now, some people argue, you know, that you should use a lower sensitivity. And this is ideal for like when you're panning left to right and the bird is flying horizontally. It may go behind a tree or behind a building or something, and when it comes back out, the camera is going to be pretty much in the same focus point that it was when the bird went behind the tree. And so when it comes out, it doesn't have to hunt as much because it'll be almost there, almost right on the bird already. So in those situations, a lower sensitivity makes sense. But for my situation at Conowingo Dam, +2 makes the most sense. Center priority is irrelevant because I'm going to be using all focus points, or I'm going to be using a small group. So center priority doesn't apply in this situation. AF limiter I have turned off. Again, because my lens, my 300 Pro lens has an AF limiter switch that starts, I think, at 1.4 meters to infinity. And that's good enough for me, but you can change this if you want to set it to higher. I probably could have got away with 10 meters, but it really wasn't an issue for me. And AF scanner, I like to leave this on. So what this does is if the camera doesn't immediately acquire autofocus, what it's going to do is rack focus from minimum focusing distance to infinity and try and find focus. So this is best if you leave this on. And then this doesn't apply. And then finally, here in the operations menu, the only thing I do is I change the function lever settings and I make sure these are set to mode 2 because I do like to change my target point. So when I'm going from a bird in flight to a bird on a stick, I'm going to switch from a all focus point area to a small focus point area. And you'll see that in the montage, at least in one of the clips. And then make sure that function lever, power lever is set to function. And then actually, this is the last thing, the card slot settings. If you're going to be using 2 memory cards, this way it'll save to both cards just as a backup. And even if one card is full, the other one will, if there's room on it, you can still write to that one. But I put 256 gig cards in, so I've never run out of space. Okay, and that's it, I believe. Everything else is whatever the default settings are fine. All right, now I'm just going to save all of these to my custom slot 2 and assign. All right, so all you have to do is put your camera in a C2 mode and then confirm that you're at 1/2000th of a second and also that your aperture is the lowest number possible. In my case, it would be f4. And that's pretty much it. And as far as shooting at 1/2000th of a second, I found that works for most things. The only exception would be like if you see a bird on a stick, you can probably go down to 1/1000th of a second, maybe a little lower, to maximize your ISO. But if a bird is flying and then maybe diving down and catching a fish, you really need to be at 1/4000th of a second. I found that, I saw some motion blur in a lot of my shots when that happened. And especially when they come out of the water with the fish, sometimes another bird will come in and try and steal it, and a fight will ensue. And again, I have a couple of shots like that where 1/2000th of a second was not fast enough, and I saw a little bit of motion blur. So again, you want to be able to quickly change your shutter speed. That's why I like to go in full stops. That's why I made that setting to 1 EV. As well as my exposure comp I set to 1 EV, because while you're shooting in burst mode, and then you might stop for a second, you want to be able to adjust your exposure quickly through exposure comp for like birds that have very bright backgrounds a lot of times and the bird is very dark, and you want to dial in a +1, +2, sometimes +3. And then eagles, they have white feathers and then a very dark brown feathers. A lot of times I found I had to dial in a -1 exposure comp when I was shooting those. So just be very conscious of your exposure compensation while you're shooting and adjusting it as you're shooting to the whatever conditions would be appropriate for the bird or for the background. Because there was this one vulture I was taking a picture of, and you'll see this one. I only dialed in a +1, and it wasn't enough, and it didn't come out too well. I really needed to be at a +3 because later on I took another picture at +3 exposure comp for this bird, and it was much better. But those are all the tips I have for now. I hope you guys found this video helpful. If so, consider buying me a coffee or making small donation on links below, because they help me to continue to make videos like this for you, and they are greatly appreciated. And one other thing is, someone asked me, how do I record the back of my screen? And it's because I use a device like this. It's made by Suki or something. I'll put a link down below to this, but it allows me to record the screen while I'm shooting. The only downside is that I can't see any of the exposure information when I'm shooting like this in the EVF or on the live view, I have to look at this screen here. And sometimes I was shooting like this, and that's why the footage might be a little bit shaky. And also I felt like it was zapping the performance of the camera a little bit. I can't quantify it, but the camera didn't quite feel as snappy or as responsive when I was recording video at the same time as I was shooting. But that said, let's go ahead and get started and watch the montage. Again, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.